Bienvenidos a este espacio de la Universidad de Manizales. La doctora Sheila McNamee visitó a Manizales, Colombia, con el apoyo de la Comisión Fulbright y la Universidad de Caldas. Con la doctora McNamee conversaron el psicólogo Ricardo Celis y la psicóloga Victoria Lugo. Los dejamos con ellos.
Y la primera pregunta que creemos que nos causa mucha curiosidad es cómo una comunicadora llega y cómo se encuentra con la psicoterapia y cuál es el puente que se teje entre la comunicación y la psicoterapia. ¿Cómo es que esos dos mundos se juntan en un momento? ¿Cuál es el pretexto de unión y de conversación entre comunicación y psicoterapia?
For me, the connection between the study of communication and psychotherapy is an intimate and important connection. Traditional psychotherapy has presumed that we need to study the psyche in order to change a person's behavior or way of being in the world. From my point of view, what we really want to change is the way in which people communicate and relate with one another. And so I take the orientation that we create our understanding of ourselves and our worlds in our interactions or in our communication with one another. And at the same time that I was studying communication, there also was this developing strand of family therapy that was very much based on communication theory, started mostly by Gregory Bateson, and elaborated by many people, but most particularly of significance in my development was the work of the Palo Alto group in California, who worked with Gregory Bateson's ideas, as did I, in understanding family dynamics. Instead of looking at a person as a problem, to look at the ways in which families communicate and create patterns of interaction, and understanding those patterns of communication from a systems point of view. So that was the point at which communication theory and psychotherapy started to merge and become one. And from there, we've had a long evolution in first starting with systems theory and then moving to systemic work, and then the evolution into constructionist ideas, I think, for many people working in psychotherapy.
Yo creo que la pregunta de Ricardo también tiene que ver con que en nuestro sistema, en Colombia, en nuestro sistema educativo, los terapeutas casi siempre, o yo diría que siempre, son psicólogos. Para nosotros la terapia está más unida a la psicología, que es muy raro ver que un comunicador se convierta en terapeuta.
In the United States as well, that is the practice, that I had to do special training in order to be able to practice as a therapist. Mm-hmm. But to simply be trained in communication as a discipline would never be sufficient to be a practicing psychotherapist. Mm-hmm. However, I do think that coming from a background of understanding the complexity of human communication really helps understand what's happening in the dynamics of someone's life, and therefore becomes a useful way of entering into therapeutic process. I wouldn't even use the term psychotherapy because I'm not particularly interested in psychological processes. I'm interested in interactive processes.
Doctora, la terapia familiar, podríamos si lo ubicáramos en algún momento de la historia, ubiquémoslo en los años 50, más o menos, años 50, años 60. Surge con mucha fuerza con algunos autores, como Salvador Minuchin, como Haley, autores muy importantes desde el modelo estructural y estratégico. Obviamente va pasando el tiempo y hay nuevos desarrollos. Se empieza a hablar de constructivismo radical, ahora estamos hablando de construccionismo social. El construccionismo social, que sigue retomando o qué retoma de estos autores clásicos como Minuchin y Haley, y de qué manera se separa también de ellos. Es decir, ¿qué los une? ¿Qué mantiene en relación a esa discusión con esos terapeutas clásicos? ¿Y de qué se distancia? ¿De qué manera se distancia de ellos?
There are probably a lot of different ways to answer the connections of all of these different strands of work. And so I'll tell you how I understand it, and it has a lot to do with my own evolution through the ideas. I think that there could be other ways of describing these connections, but this is the way I understand them. I understand two different disciplines, essentially, developing in two different ways. We have in sociology and in social psychology people beginning to play with the ideas of social construction. In sociology in particular, people were influenced by the work of Berger and Luckman, the social construction of reality. At the same time, we have in the family therapy field an evolution of ideas emanating from Bateson's work and the idea of systems theory. And so at first we have a movement away from an individual orientation to psychotherapy where we just study the individual, to now understanding systems and family systems in particular, and using the ideas from systems theory of feedback and structure and hierarchy and homeostasis to try to examine how family patterns create pathology or problems in the family. So it's not a person that's a problem, but it's a pattern that's a problem. And that was a really innovative and important move in the evolution of how some people were thinking about psychotherapy. In that we have then people like Minuchin, who really picks up certain concepts from systems theory. In particular, he picked up the concepts of hierarchy and structure and boundaries of systems. We have Haley and the Mental Research Institute picking up, known as strategic therapy, picking up different concepts from systems theory like positive feedback, negative feedback, family homeostasis. So all of these people were working with systems theory, but they were just highlighting and playing with different concepts from systems theory. Those ideas were very generative, and then the idea emerged that we were still we were no longer treating the individual as an object to study that had a problem. Now we're treating the family as an object of study that has a problem. And so the idea of second-order cybernetics emerged, where the therapist then recognizes his or her part in creating the system, that the questions a therapist asks create possibilities or constraints in how a family talks about itself and how we understand the family. So we move from systems theory, or what was known as first-order cybernetics, we evolved into second-order cybernetics. At the same time, second-order cybernetics was very interested and connected with some names. Some people were working in that area of second-order cybernetics who refer to themselves also as radical constructivists. So recognizing that we are part of constructing the world that we live in by looking at the ways in which a therapist in particular interacts with a family. Ernst von Glasersfeld would be one name that's very popular in radical constructivism. So another elaboration at this time of second-order cybernetics, and also bringing the radical constructivist understanding together, was elaborated very beautifully in the work of the Milan Systemic team, the Milan School. And so they were doing something really interesting in that they were completely recognizing the part the therapist plays. So they were very much in second-order cybernetic space, if you will. And they became interested in how people construct their worlds. But through the work of Carl Tom in Canada, he introduced the Milan associates, Gianfranco Cecchine and Luigi Boscolo in particular, to the communication theorist who I was working with at the time, and introduced a communication theory that was rooted in social construction. It was called the Coordinated Management of Meaning Theory, and both Carl Tom and the Milan guys, Gianfranco Cecchine and Luigi Boscolo, became very interested in this communication theory as a way of understanding how people construct reality in the way that they talk and act and relate with one another. So this was all very coherent with the evolution from systems theory, but it was also something very different in that moment. And in fact, my PhD dissertation was about the Milan School of Therapy and this particular communication theory. So in the marriage, if you will, between Milan's systemic therapy and the coordinated management of meaning theory, we had really a very clearly articulated focus on communication patterns, and less, while there was an influence from systems theory for certain, it was more, the focus was more on how people are creating meaning together and how people create a reality. And that's where I think social construction started in some ways replacing the language of systems theory for understanding psychopathology and family dynamics, and more the language of communication and creating a world. Social constructionist language started to take hold in that time. And this, I would say, was in the 90s, around the 1990s.
Do you think that the social constructionism is like another stage, another movement from the systemic therapy, or it's like, or is a completely different movement? It's like in the path of the evolution of this, or it's not? It's completely different.
I think it's a variation on a theme. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think that the language of systems and systems theory and second-order cybernetics was incredibly generative and useful when we looked back at the evolution and we see the movement away from the focus on individual and individual pathology residing in the person. But I think that language of systems became limited in some way because we weren't really looking, we were still looking at people interacting. I think when we move into social construction, we're looking at the interaction. Mm-hmm. So in a very subtle way, because I think second-order cybernetics and the systemic work was very much looking at patterns, but they're still looking at people as producing those patterns, so the people were still sort of the primary focus. Instead, as we move into social construction, we are looking at the process completely.
Yo lo que veo es que el construccionismo, algunos construccionistas tienen en cuenta lo que es la teoría de sistemas. Tengo un prejuicio, no sé si sea cierto o no, quisiera como esa claridad, y es que cuando el construccionista lee teoría de sistemas abiertos, Bertalanffy. Y tengo el prejuicio que no lee lo que es la teoría de sistemas cerrados, autopoéticos, más vía maturana. Porque si fuese así, la teoría de sistemas cerrados, autopoéticos, su foco sí tiene que ver con la interacción, no solamente qué pasa con los elementos y las partes que interactúan, sino qué pasa allí en la relación. ¿Es el construccionismo entonces más cercano a la idea de teoría de sistemas abiertos y no lee la teoría de sistemas autopoéticos?
First, I would say that I I don't think social construction has taken anything from systems theory, frankly. That it's as if two people are traveling on parallel roads using different ways of talking about a very similar processes, trying to articulate process but using different language. That's how I see social construction and systems. I think the people who have been using systems theory in therapy, in psychotherapy, saw the utility of the language of social construction and brought that into their work from a systems perspective. But to social constructionists, most social constructionists don't know about systems theory and von Bertalanffy, the open systems, nor Maturana, autopoetic systems. So that language is in fact, many social constructionists wouldn't even reference Gregory Bateson as a significant source. So they're two different disciplines, and here's a way of understanding the difference. The discipline of social construction emerged within an academic discipline of mostly social psychology and sociology, and systems theory emerged within more of a practitioner-oriented discipline of family therapy. And so I think we just have two different ways, two different discourses that, because of some pioneering people like Carl Thom, connections were made between these two discourses. And I would add that I feel privileged in my position because in the academic discipline of communication as well as social psychology and sociology, as constructionist ideas evolved in those domains, my interest, I had a practical interest in taking those ideas and putting them into practice. I was very interested with therapeutic process. So I always, from the time of my PhD work until now, have tried to straddle the world of putting ideas into practice. It's been very important not just to be an academic scholar examining communication patterns. I want to look at them in a practice domain of therapy and organizational change and community change. And so I think it's those kind of hybrid moves and that I've been lucky enough to be part of that have, there are a number of us who do this kind of work and have brought these two worlds together in a way that probably wouldn't have happened if we hadn't tried to put constructionist ideas into practice.
Yo lo que veo frente a eso, mi postura para conversarla con ustedes es que para mí es difícil entender el construccionismo sin teoría de sistemas, ya que cuando el construccionismo habla de Bateson, cuando tiene la idea de patrón, de organización, está hablando de sistemas, está hablando de teoría de sistemas, y está hablando de retroalimentación, y está hablando de cibernética de primero y de segundo orden, que son los conceptos centrales de teoría de sistemas. Entonces lo que yo veo es que tal vez históricamente el construccionismo nace más por la vía de la posmodernidad, algunos conversando con teoría de sistemas, pero más desde la filosofía, ¿sí? Más Derrida, Guattari, Deleuze, todos esos autores desde la filosofía, pero hay otros que entraron por la vía de la terapia, ¿sí? Y por la vía de la terapia es la vía de la terapia sistémica. Entonces yo creo que allí lo que yo veo es que hay una tensión interesante, académica, y que en la acción tiene implicaciones que pueden ser importantes.
I mean, not that it's really a question, but I agree. Social construction is a philosophical orientation. And I would say it is one of many elaborations of postmodern ideas, drawing on many postmodern theorists. And so your elaboration of seeing systems theory and social construction and postmodern ideas all together, I think, is a byproduct of a particular era that we are in now. That's how we see these things. But I think if we go back and look at the evolution of family therapy, of psychotherapy, of constructionist ideas, of systems theory, we can see these as different trends that in the contemporary moment are now, you can't talk about one without the other. There are people, groups around the world who have not been trained at all in systems ideas and do therapy as a process of social construction. So there are separations. I think that it's the location in Colombia. My understanding is that systemic work and social constructionist ideas are intimately connected.
Why do you think that in Colombia in particular is this kind of relation between systems theory and...
I have a theory, I don't know if it's correct, which is I see Eduardo Villar in Bogota
Eduardo Villar, el de sistemas humanos,
as he and his colleagues as critical in beginning systemic training in Colombia. I may be wrong, but that's how I see it. And Eduardo was very supported by Peter Lang from the Kensington Consultation Center in London. Peter Lang was with me and others in Calgary, Canada, at the moment that Carl Tom brought us as communication theorists and the Milan systemic work together. So we had social construction meeting systemic practice. And Peter Lang then developed what he came to call systemic constructionist practice. And Eduardo adopted Peter Lang's model when he and his colleagues created Sistemas Humanos. So that's my understanding, because I think from there many systemically oriented, constructionist-oriented programs emerged in the different universities throughout Colombia, offering systemic training from a constructionist point of view.
Yo tengo una idea.
I have another idea.
Frente a esa posible historia. Esa puede ser una
Una
mirada. Tal vez la escuela con mayor tradición en lo sistémico en Colombia es la Universidad de Santo Tomás, con Jairo Estupiñán y otra, Ángel Hernández, que la viste conocer en la Javeriana de Cali, en la Javeriana de Bogotá. Y se va teniendo un desarrollo teórico frente a eso. Obviamente, como históricamente parten de lo estructural y lo estratégico, como fue lo normal en la mayoría de los terapeutas sistémicos, y se encuentran después de unos años con el constructivismo, y se le da mucha fuerza al constructivismo radical, mucha fuerza, que obviamente eso es teoría de sistemas. Y se empieza a leer a Yergen, se empieza a leer a Sheila, a Schneidman, a todos esos construccionistas, y se empieza a hacer allí una conversación. Creo que esa escuela que creo que es la que ha formado más terapeutas, más sistémicos, más que Eduardo, aunque Eduardo también ha sido muy importante, el desarrollo que ha tenido es el construccionismo de la mano de la teoría de sistemas. No lo ha separado. Por eso es interesante la versión que tienes de un construccionismo aparte de la teoría de sistemas. Para mí, desde mi formación, no me cabe en la cabeza que exista un construccionismo aparte de la teoría de sistemas, pero claro, lo reconozco y está bien, y es una mirada. Pero en Colombia creo que tal vez, esa es mi versión, ha habido una sinergia muy fuerte entre construccionismo y teoría de sistemas. Creo que allí puede haber una postura o un desarrollo, no sé si original o un desarrollo que pueda ser importante en la discusión con el construccionismo.
And that's exactly what I mean, that in the Colombian context, and also to some extent in the British context, for many people, these two are connected, constructionism and systemic work, but not to everyone.
In Latin America, it's like the same, like Colombia?
I think so. I think largely, yes. Although I think in Brazil, where I've done a lot of work, there are more people whose grounding is in social construction and never really did systemic training. But I would add that those are younger people who are, in the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20, have been learning. But the older generation is very much grounded in this systemic constructionist, unity. But the younger generation now, they maybe don't even know about systemic work.
Sheila, yo te quería preguntar sobre la influencia que los sociólogos de la Escuela de Chicago han tenido sobre el construccionismo social. ¿Cómo el construccionismo social toma también de estas ideas construccionistas de los sociólogos en Estados Unidos?
The Chicago School, like many other schools of thought, has been a very important part of social construction and the development of social constructionist theory. The way that many of us see it is that, in particular, the Chicago School was really attempting to move toward an understanding of the relational, the social, as the center of creating understanding and meaning, and most particularly creating a sense of self, of identity. So, constructionism owes a lot to the work of all the theorists included in the Chicago School. And at the same time, there is a sense, if you look back at that work, that while there's an emphasis on the social, the starting place is still the individual. So the thought is, how do I understand myself by virtue of my relationship with you? So we're still trying to understand how a person understands. A constructionist perspective today, and I have to say, it wasn't always. So Berger and Luckman are still, I think, in that Chicago School frame. Today, we've moved further along in not privileging always the individual as the starting place, the person as the starting place. And instead, we shine the light on the in-between, the process of what people are doing, and understand that any meaning, whether the meaning is knowledge, understanding of the world, understanding of ourselves, always emerges from relational process. And so our focus isn't on individuals, but it's on the process. What are people doing together, and what are their actions, their co-actions, making? What possibilities and constraints emerge from that making? And so the shift, again, just to summarize, the work of the Chicago School has been incredibly informative and formative of constructionist ideas. And over time, we have pushed further into what I would call the relational realm, the radically relational realm.
Hay un tema que es muy interesante, que es todo lo que tiene que ver con los diálogos generativos o los diálogos propositivos. Los diálogos propositivos, en Colombia algunos lo llaman también diálogos como centrados en la connotación positiva. Y aparentemente es una idea, es muy interesante, pero aparentemente es fácil de entender, pero yo creo que muchas veces se malinterpreta. ¿Qué sería exactamente un diálogo propositivo y qué no es un diálogo propositivo?
I think we've come to use the term dialogue from a constructionist stance as associated always with generative social transformation. So I think that we wouldn't connect the idea of dialogue and not something generative or opening possibilities. But the idea about dialogue is, as one elaboration of social constructionist ideas, is that we create a space where people can really pay attention to the ways in which together they are creating an understanding. And also, we create a space where people can become curious about differences. That doesn't mean that dialogue solves a problem or that people come to agreement, but that people are invited into new forms of understanding differences. And that's really what dialogue is about. So is every dialogue generative? I think we can't know until we see what happens after a dialogue. So let's say that every dialogue has the possibility of being generative, and whether that possibility is realized, is made real, really depends upon the participants in the dialogue. So I don't think every dialogue is always generative, but certainly the attempt is to create a dialogic space where new understandings and new meanings emerge.
Do you think that this issue about dialogue is important for all social constructionism, or for this one special that is relational called? So my question is, not all the social construction is the same. So the dialogue is more important for this relational orientation more than for others?
Yeah. I think your question raises the opportunity for me to clarify one thing, and that is I have started to prefer to use the term relational construction or relational constructionism as opposed to social construction or social constructionism because, as you point out, there are many, many, many understandings of what social construction means, and not all are compatible with the ideas that I'm trying to talk about here today. Mm-hmm. So this relational orientation that really says we look first at relational processes and we can understand who we are as people only as a byproduct of relational process. That's a very different perspective than some other versions of social construction. And so I think, yes, in what I would call this relational constructionist orientation, dialogue becomes a central resource, a central concept and idea. And in other versions of social construction, it probably has no meaning or no place.
Hay un concepto que usted plantea, que es el de la responsabilidad relacional, que me ha parecido muy, muy interesante. Uno cómo puede palpar ese concepto en un ejercicio de relación terapéutica.
So, first, just briefly, the idea of relational responsibility is was my response to critiques of a constructionist approach, which basically were naive critiques that claimed that because constructionists believe that we can construct our world in different ways, there was no responsibility or no moral obligation, because if we didn't like something, we could simply construct it differently. That's not the case. That's not what constructionism is about. And so I found using the term relational responsibility very useful. And I define relational responsibility as being attentive to the process of relating itself. So, in a therapeutic context, one would hope that the therapist would be being attentive to what is being constructed in the conversation with clients. There are several ways of elaborating relational responsibility, of paying attention to what we're doing and shifting the discourse. And one of those ways is to think about the multiple voices that we have available for entering into the conversation. So, for example, when we're talking with someone, we could talk from the voice of pathology and deficit, or we could speak from with our voice of possibility and potential. When are people able to be in control of their lives and not let the problem control them? So we have multiple voices, and if we're being attentive to the process of relating, we would constantly be asking ourselves, which voice might I use in this conversation, in this interactive moment, that could be perhaps useful and transformative for us in this therapeutic moment. If the therapist is being attentive to the process of relating, then the therapist is continually engaging in some sort of inner dialogue and thinking, what voice could I use that could invite a conversation that might be more generative? So maybe I use the voice of possibility instead of the voice of deficit. Maybe I use the voice of a friend instead of the voice of a therapist. Maybe, so.
These multiple voices are similar to the concept of Bakhtin's about polyphony. Is like in the same way?
Yes, exactly. I mean, the notion of multiple voices is absolutely taken from Bakhtin. And using this, that thought, what we think of as private thinking, always takes place in language. Without language, there is no thought. And because we participate in so many different languaging communities, we have multiple voices, multiple resources for action, for talk and action. At the same time, Bakhtin's notion that nothing is ever said for the first time, that everything is double voiced. Well, that very much so. In our conversation here, how will then I turn and talk to someone tomorrow, kind of giving voice to something that we have said here, and yet the meaning will be entirely different because we're speaking into a different relationship and a different context.
And the same also that he said about that you don't have your own voice in the literally way.
Right.
That is the voices of all of others that are speaking or were speaking to you in the past or are speaking in the present.
Right. And so everything is borrowed. We are born into traditions and conventions for action. The way you have 2-hour lunch in Colombia is a tradition that you are born into that seems natural, and in other parts of the world where I live, you don't even stop for lunch. That these aren't things that we make up ourselves. We carry these traditions, these voices, these ways of acting are kind of borrowed from traditions, contexts, cultures.
¿Cómo explicar la popularidad del construccionismo social en una época en donde lo que yo percibo es que cada vez se le da más fuerza a la psicología y a la terapia basada en la evidencia? ¿Cómo explicar entonces la popularidad que está teniendo casi paradójicamente con los desarrollos que se están teniendo científicos por otra vía?
I think that sometimes we live in bubbles, and so we're in a bubble of people who like these ideas and we share them, and so it seems like they're very popular. And I think they have gained enormous popularity and strength. But there is still the world that really does believe in evidence-based practice and in positivist science, and that if we just work hard enough, we'll find the right method to solve the problems. However, I think many practitioners, and I mean therapists, consultants, community workers, many practitioners are very frustrated by evidence-based practice and the limitations it puts on them. And that's when I think these ideas start becoming generative and useful. And there are many people who are working. Scott Miller's work is a really good example of trying to find ways, he actually has a way, of working with clients that is dialogic, relationally sensitive, open to the construction of new understandings, and at the same time can provide some kind of outcome measures that satisfy people who want evidence-based practice. So I think the struggle with evidence-based practice has really spawned a lot of creativity and innovation in taking these ideas and trying to use them in ways that show other people how generative relational orientations can be. Do you know, could I say something else about evidence-based practice that's really fascinating? Evidence-based practice actually started as a really useful thing in the sense that there was this idea that if we could aggregate the data and find out in general what's working, then we could give that information to practitioners. And practitioners would then use it in a one-to-one context where they would have to adjust the practice because they had to adjust it to the person they were working with. And then the idea is that that information about the adjustment and how it works would go back to inform the aggregate data so that there would constantly be a change in what our understanding is about evidence and what works. This started in the medical field, and doctors, of course, they don't deal with aggregates, they deal with a person. But they use the results of aggregated data of different diagnoses and treatments and so forth to inform their practice one-on-one with someone. But the practice one-on-one should feed back to the aggregate. It's that connection of feeding back that's been dropped, and all we have is oversight boards, correction, making sure that people only use certain methods because they have been proven through large-scale studies to be more effective. So it's become a problem, but it started out as not a problem.
What do you think is the future of the social constructionisms? Where are going to be in the future?
That's an impossible question to answer. but you know, not only, but primarily through the Taos Institute, we see such incredible innovation around the world of people putting these ideas into practice. Some people putting the ideas into practice probably can't even articulate the theoretical assumptions or the whole philosophical orientation of social construction, but they live it and they do it. And so I think the future, because at the Taos Institute, we've been most interested in not keeping these ideas in the academy as a philosophical orientation, but saying philosophy informs life. Philosophy, this philosophical orientation should be a way of living together in the world. And so at the Taos Institute, we really try to promote and support in any way we can people who we see doing relational constructionist work on the ground with people in different contexts. And I think in the future, we're going to see, we already have seen a blossoming of practices and wonderful, huge social change efforts. I think we're just going to see more and more. And I think the ideas will continue to evolve. I don't think we'll stay, in 10 years, we'll be saying some different things than we're saying right now. Just as we thought systems theory was a huge innovation against the backdrop of individualism, in 10 or 20 years, there's going to be something that makes what we're talking about right now seem kind of silly and old and limited. Mm-hmm. So.
Para finalizar, Sheila McNamee va a estar entretenida los próximos 5 años rastreando qué pregunta.
I think I'll continue to pose the question that I already pose daily to myself, which is, how to put these ideas into action for the good of humanity. I think in the next 5 years, I'll be thinking about that question and also asking myself specifically, what are the best ways of doing that? Are the best ways of doing that writing, lecturing, talking, or are the best ways of doing that working with people and meeting people and engaging in conversation? And I think I'll also be asking myself how I can help to elevate and support the work that other people are doing around the world that is making for a better social world.
Bueno, Sheila, vamos a dejar esta conversación hasta aquí. Esperamos que la podamos retomar más adelante y bueno, estas fueron algunas ideas acerca del construccionismo social y sus aplicaciones en distintas áreas de la psicología, de la terapia, del cambio social.